Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, a confusing stay-at-home order, a malignant alliance between government and big tech, and the need to invest in Canadian oil.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Welcome, everyone, to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Lockdown, forced by state mandate to stay in the home studio for the next month. Well, at least at home. I think I might be allowed to head to the bathroom or head to the kitchen. We'll see how things go. Who knows? If the restrictions get any further, then I might be confined to here, in which case we'll do shows all the time. It'll be great. This is day one of Ontario's new stay-at-home order, which is a term that you'd think would invite a little bit of clarity, although that hasn't at all been the case. So as of 12:01 this morning Eastern Time, Ontarians have to stay home unless they have an essential reason to leave. Now, what is essential, you might ask? Well, that's a great question. There are, I think, like 20 some odd reasons that you can leave home. One of them is if you work, but only if your employer has determined you have to be in a physical place other than home. You can attend school, you can get childcare, you can get food, you can get personal care items, you can get things you need to maintain or clean your house, you can get something from curbside pickup, you can do a lot of other things here. You can exercise, take your dog for a walk. This is all fine, but there's a big question mark as to what this actually means. Because on one hand, it's stay at home. But on the other hand, 5 people can get together outdoors, but 10 people can get together indoors for a wedding. You have to go out for only essential things, but non-essential businesses can still sell you things by curbside. And all of this was making people scratch their heads so much. I was trying to cover this as it was coming out. This was announced on, I think, Tuesday. And the thing that was so bizarre about it is that they kept changing the actual guidelines. And we had a press release from the Ontario government. We had an FAQ that was released. We had all of these other documents except for the actual stay-at-home order. And I want to draw your attention. This is the order in council signed by Premier Doug Ford from the Ontario government. Goes into effect. You can see it right there under Section 2 at 12:01 a.m. on January 14th, 2021. Now look at when it was approved. January 13th, 5:56 p.m. So this was put out 6 hours before it was put in law, which means if you're a business or an individual who's affected by this, especially on the work from home stuff, because now you have to decide as a business, if someone can do their job from home, they have to legally. There's no wiggle room there. So you had 6 hours to comply with this. And as of today, we are now living in an era in which police can theoretically question you as to why you are out. Now, the government says they just want people to stay home. They say it's perfectly clear, just stay home. This was something Doug Ford even tweeted as far as our little wake-up call goes this morning. He said, "Good morning, Ontario, stay home." That's actually what my phone says every morning. Good morning and stay home. It doesn't actually. But they say it's perfectly clear, even though everyone's been asking questions. Small business owners saying, according to the Toronto Star, we need more clarification on this. Well, you're out of time. Police services saying they have way more questions than answers on enforcing the new stay-at-home order. This was a recurring theme that I was seeing, where law enforcement officials were saying, well, we can't answer questions about how we're going to enforce this because we haven't actually seen the order. So technically, police were supposed to be out enforcing this law at 12:01 a.m. this morning, and they had no idea what the law would be until just shy of 6 p.m. yesterday because it kept changing. And what the government has done in some ways is clamp down on people, but in other ways, they've just put in something that looks more theatrical than anything else. And the reason I say that is because they aren't actually answering a lot of the questions that are most necessary to have answered. This frequently asked question thing they put out, admittedly, this came out on Wednesday morning. So this was Wednesday morning responding to the confusion from Tuesday afternoon. And this, again, was also something that was changed a few times after it before it was put in place. But of all the questions that people are asking, the government cannot determine, is what they're saying. So what's an essential item? The government can't determine what is essential for every person in this province. Now, to be fair, I agree with this. I agree that determining essential or non-essential is stupid, and this was something Jason Kenney and I talked about at great length when we sat down just prior to the end of the year. So for me, non-essential might be different than it is for you. One of us might think that carrots are essential. Someone else might think that a guitar amp is essential. And I would say that if you can safely shop, then it doesn't really matter what you're buying. But the government here is saying, on one hand, we're limiting, you can only go out for essential reasons, but then refusing to define that. Which, again, I agree with. I'm just pointing out the inconsistency. They say they can't determine what an essential trip is. They say they can't determine what essential work is. Is there a time limit for how long people can leave their homes? No. Well, we're asking people to use their best judgment. Is there a limit on the number of times someone can leave their home in a day? No. We're asking Ontarians to use their best judgment. Can people travel to their cottages or secondary residences? In the spirit of the stay-at-home order, at this time, we are not recommending intra-provincial travel. And the stay-at-home order says, well, you're allowed to go to a cottage or something for less than a day or more than 14 days. But the whole point of this is that on one hand, they're saying this is a state of emergency. We must do all of this. And then on the other hand, they're just saying, you know what, just figure it out. You use your best judgment. And again, I mean, my whole approach to this since the beginning has been let people use their best judgment. But having a state of emergency with law enforcement able to fine and harass and harangue does not jive with what this government is now saying, which is that, well, you know what, companies can figure out for themselves what non-essential work is, what essential work is. We have our list of industries, but as far as working from home, just figure it out. And the problem with the just figure it out approach, which sounds good on paper, is that if on one hand you have the government saying that, but on the other hand, you actually have creeping into the frontline law enforcement officers the opposite of that from perhaps someone along the chain, maybe a commander or something or a captain, and they're actually saying, well, no, the province has said stay at home, therefore we need to start pulling over cars on the street like a ride program, and instead of smelling the breath, we're going to say, smells like non-essential products in here. This smells like you've been doing something non-essential. Get out, hands on the hood. So I don't know. And again, this is at this point speculative, but with only 6 hours to review this, speculation is all we had. Speculation is all we had. So it's one thing to say, good morning, Ontario, stay home. It's another thing to call it a stay-at-home order. But this is not something that we should be celebrating. Unclear laws and rules and orders in council are not to be celebrated. And remember, we talked on the show Monday with Ryan O'Connor about a curfew, because at the time there was a talk of there potentially being a curfew imposed in Ontario. And a lot of what happened in that discourse, I have to think, was deliberate. I think that the government wanted to dangle out the curfew idea so that whatever they did would look reasonable, because they already determined they weren't actually putting a curfew in. That's one way to parse what happened. Now, just because we don't have a curfew, I'm not exhaling and saying, okay, great, civil liberties protected. Because if we find out in the coming days that law enforcement are starting to harass people or detain people or force them to question what it is that they're doing when they're out, then we actually have a 24/7 curfew. It's not a curfew from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. It's an all-day, all-night curfew, because now you have to justify your existence at any point. Now, I had posted a little tongue-in-cheek clip on Twitter where I said, I'm all ready to go for the lockdown. I'm all ready to go because I've got my essential permit. This is a clip that may be familiar to some of you.
Not to worry. I have a permit.
This just says I can do what I want.
That is like an evergreen one. I think I've dug that out a couple of times throughout the course of the pandemic. We might need to start like issuing True North cards that just say that I can do what I want, hashtag True North or something. I don't know. I'll bring it up with the team. But the whole point of what's happening right now is that if we are leaving people to their own devices and saying you can decide for yourself, then why not actually let them decide for themselves? If we can shop at a grocery store safely, why can we not go to church safely? If we can shop at a Costco safely, why can we not shop at a guitar store safely or something like that? And the problem with this doublespeak is that it is what undermines people's confidence and trust in the system. And this is something we've seen throughout the entirety of the pandemic. When people don't understand the rules or can't make sense of them or see contradictions in them, they start to just shrug. And even well-meaning people who follow this stuff religiously, people like me who will look up the Order in Council, if I can't make sense of this, the average person who just scrolls the headlines and maybe not even that, they're certainly not going to understand the distinction between government issue stay-at-home order and, well, you can actually leave home for this, and you can, if you're single, go to another household, and you can do all that stuff. So what I'm asking for is not a genuine stay-at-home order. I'm asking for clarity so that we aren't on one hand saying we're doing something else, and on the other hand not. Because all that this leads to is a mentality when cases still keep going up of people saying, well, I guess we didn't go far enough. And the answer to that is to say, well, no, it's because the original guidelines were not communicated at all with any sort of clarity, so we can't expect them to have actually had the desired effect. And remember that, well, people in Ontario and elsewhere in the country, like in Quebec, are being told not to leave their homes and denied this right and that right, and businesses are being shut down. There's a certain class of person that is exempt from the rules. This story out of British Columbia is simply asinine. Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, who is currently on bail in British Columbia, her family was granted a federal travel exemption by the immigration minister's office to come into Canada despite having no legal basis to come to Canada. So this is a woman who is literally on trial. A woman who's literally on trial. And Meng Wanzhou's husband, Liu Zhaozong, and if you speak Mandarin, I'm sorry if I've butchered that, but her husband and their children applied for an exemption to the travel ban, to the border closure, to travel from China in December. They came here and they are still here. And they were authorized, specifically authorized to get around the law. Right now, you're only allowed to come if you have immediate family who are either Canadian citizens or permanent residents. Wanzhou is neither of them. She is here under detention. She is here being detained while extradition is pending to the United States. And the Prime Minister's office is not commenting if it knew about the application. The parliamentary secretary to the Foreign Affairs Minister, Rob Oliphant, defended it. He said, Canada is a country of the rule of law. We do not let whether we like someone or dislike someone get in the way of us absolutely fulfilling our responsibilities. I think we should absolutely do that. We should absolutely do that because this is not a country that should have an open border approach, especially when the border is closed to anyone else. If my friend wants to come and see the beautiful Rocky Mountains, he can't do it. If my friend wants to go somewhere else, I'm talking about any friend, not a specific friend, but Americans cannot come to Canada, Brits cannot come to Canada, yet if you are a Chinese national whose wife is on trial in Canada, you're allowed to get around the law and come and spend an indefinite amount of time here. So we should absolutely say, you know what, we actually don't like you. You don't have a right to come here. Ergo, we're not going to just open up the gates for you on this. That is an entirely reasonable response. Now, at this level, and again, this part is speculative, but former Canadian Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques says that discussions at this level definitely would have gone to the desk of the minister. So it's very possible, very likely that the minister authorized or at the very least knew about this, which means that the Trudeau government is complicit in this particular decision. One lawyer in Toronto, an immigration lawyer, Chantal Desloges, says that this is already discretionary. Lots of people who have a legitimate claim get turned down. So why on earth, I ask, would this one not go the same route? But here's the issue. If you support the border closure, if you support the idea of shutting down the border, making it so people can't travel to Canada and making it difficult for people even to visit their families, then at the very least, if we're going to make an exception for anyone, let's not make it for a Meng Wanzhou's family. This is not an unreasonable thing. So right now, what happens is anyone connected with the Chinese Politburo seems to be doing completely fine. We had, theme parks opening in Wuhan. We have Chinese nationals connected to Huawei, which is an extension of the state Politburo that are allowed to come to Canada when no one else can. And it's weird. I mean, how my friend Mark Stein has pointed it out that it's just China's world and we're all living in it. And that seems truer and truer with each passing day. We've got to take a break. We'll be back with more of The Andrew Lawton Show. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
We are back, and as we talked about on the previous show, Parler, the supposed conservative pro-free speech alternative to Facebook and Twitter, is still offline. The CEO of Parler the other day said that it might not ever come back. They don't know, because they're finding that not a single vendor wants to do business with them. Some of them might have a moral objection. Others might just be afraid of themselves being boycotted, and we'll be talking about boycotts in another context in the next segment. But this is the reality of it. And when I talked about this last week, I actually had some pushback from people that thought I was kind of talking about this from both sides. On one hand, I said, yes, I'm a libertarian. Companies need to self-regulate and the market will prevail, or should. And on the other hand, I conceded that the libertarian approach has a lot of significant challenges, which is where Parler is right now, which is that you have to build your own internet. You have to build your own everything. And I wasn't trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I was just trying to concede that I understand the libertarian utopia that I would like to be the case is not, in fact, as easy. That's all. That's all I was pointing out. And yes, companies can self-host, and we're moving more and more towards that. I think the real lesson here has to be that you cannot create a business that is dependent on another business, especially if you're doing something remotely connected to conservative politics. But it is interesting that a lot of people that hated Parler, that hated Trump, were using the events of the Capitol raid as an excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway. And we see this with the impeachment of Donald Trump. A lot of the impeachment rhetoric started before he even took office. So the impeachment was going to happen. The reason he's been impeached twice is because he would be impeached 19 times if they could do it. They just want him out. And they want conservatives off the internet. They want Parler off the internet. So they're going to use whatever cudgel they can to achieve that. It is interesting, though, because everyone wanted to blame Parler, which is this upstart, relatively small organization, without actually looking at the role that Facebook and Twitter had in themselves becoming venues for people to talk about their discontent with the U.S. government, which, again, according to the logic of the last week, is what led to the Capitol raid. People talking about it on social media. Facebook itself is implicated in this. Sheryl Sandberg, who's a Facebook executive, said, no, Facebook is not really responsible. And this is a piece in the Stamford Advocate pointing out how 100,000 users posted hashtags that include Stop the Steal and Fight for Trump. Now, this is something that as well, if we are to use Facebook's and Twitter's and Amazon's and Apple's and Google's own logic against them, well, we've got to deplatform Facebook now. This is the reality. I'm just looking for equality across the board here. So here's the problem, though. I don't like big tech companies. I really don't like government. And this story has not gotten a lot of attention yet, but a briefing note in the Heritage Ministry in Canada called Regulation of Social Media Platforms indicates that the Canadian government will be tabling a bill this year, early this year, that will challenge and actually, in some cases, censor the content put on social media, specifically on the big tech platforms. This is from Blacklock's reporter. Cabinet will introduce regulations to curb Twitter and Facebook posts deemed hurtful or offensive, says Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault's department. Now remember, hate speech already illegal in Canada, has been for years. We already have laws that govern speech that meets a very high threshold of criminality. Anything beyond that will simply be about speech that the government doesn't like. And by forcing Facebook and Twitter to deal with this, lest they be fined or penalized, and again, we don't yet know for sure what the rule is going to look like, all these companies will have to do is take a broader and more aggressive approach to moderation, which means less speech, not more. So whenever anyone starts talking about, oh, well, I support free speech, but I don't support hate speech, you have to ask them to define hate speech. And I sat in on the meetings of the Heritage Committee when they were debating and discussing what has become this law. I listened to the ones I wasn't in Ottawa for. I read the report. Nowhere is hate speech defined. The only definition that exists is the criminal code definition, which clearly won't be their definition, because if it were, it wouldn't actually be necessary because that speech is already illegal. So this is going to be used as a weapon against quote-unquote offensive speech, which is the only type of speech that needs legal protection. You don't need legal protection for benign, inoffensive speech because no one would challenge its existence. And the only thing worse than big tech censorship is government censorship. The only thing worse than that is government-empowered big tech censorship, because then you don't even have the legal remedies that you do if the government's going after you. So mark my words, this is going to be a very dark day for the internet. We've got to wrap things up for this segment. We'll be back in a few moments with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. We talk a lot about cancel culture, people trying to boycott. Well, what about when it happens to the Canadian energy sector? A lot of people might not be aware of this, but there's a movement afoot in a lot of areas, not the least of which is academia, that is trying to get people to divest from Canada's energy sector. A group has come up to respond to this and explain why it's not just wrong, but not even particularly effective, and that is InvestNow, which just launched in the last few weeks here. The executive director, Gina Pappano, joins me now. Gina, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So what is InvestNow and why was it necessary?
Well, InvestNow is a not-for-profit dedicated to challenging the divestment narrative. Why is it necessary? We think that people don't realize that these movements are taking place, starting out in the universities and colleges, also religious organizations. And in Canada, it's slowly but surely making its way into pension funds, divestments, institutional funds, and municipalities are speaking about divestment. So we decided to launch InvestNow to challenge the divestment narrative, to say divestment is wrong. It doesn't achieve what it's purported to achieve, which is doesn't reduce emissions. And Canada has some of the best energy companies in the world. It doesn't reduce demand, so the supply will come from elsewhere.
Let's take a couple of steps back here for people that aren't familiar with this. What is the actual process that's happening as it pertains to energy, and what's the rationale used when agencies or institutions or even just investment funds are making these determinations?
Well, what's happening is a group out of the US called 350.org is setting up pockets on campus. Let's take a campus activist groups as an example. So they're setting up activist groups on campus who are writing letters to the Board of Governors, because it's the Board of Governors and the university presidents that are making these decisions. And they're asking for the endowment fund to be divested of fossil fuels. And they give it timelines. And the reason is because they are trying to send the message that fossil fuels are bad, and to divest is right and to invest is wrong. And so the Board of Governors has a vote. These groups are setting up protests on campus. And then they like Guelph is a perfect example. Last year they voted for divestment, and only 3 people voted against it on the Board of Governors. So we're realizing that the other side is not being told, the other side of the messaging, and we're trying to write our own letters to the Board of Governors and university presidents to say, consider this, especially for Canada. don't think people realize how important the Canadian energy sector is to the economy, to running universities, to running everything in our cities. And we want to get that message out there.
We know that Canadian energy stocks, to use one metric, are in a pretty rough spot. I think a lot of people who have invested in this have been, and I include myself in this category, a bit frustrated with performance or underperformance in some ways. You, of course, worked at the TSX. You're well aware of this. This is not about the actual economics of this, though, correct? These aren't determinations because people are saying they're not sound investments.
No, these are more based on an ideological framework.
Wow.
So they're taking away a whole sector. So they're not saying don't invest in fossil fuels because the returns aren't great. They're saying don't invest in fossil fuels at all. So even companies that are performing well, which there are some, and the pension funds or the investors can't invest in that company because they've committed to not investing in any fossil fuel company. So that's the issue. It's that you're removing an entire sector from the investment portfolio.
A lot of us expect these sorts of very, frankly, wacky, and I don't say that to downplay how damaging it is, but a lot of us expect this sort of wackiness from academia and from universities. But you said this is starting to creep a little bit into the mainstream. How is that?
Yes. Well, just recently, a group of students put out a video for the Ontario teachers to pressure the Ontario teachers pension plan to divest from fossil fuels. So it's starting to creep into pension funds, and also Canada Pension Plan has been approached by these activist groups to divest from fossil fuels. So it starts out in the universities, but it's gaining momentum, and especially in Canada where we have the best in the world in terms of energy companies for ESG reasons. They're transparent. Our corporate governance standards are very high, and so we want to think about what you're doing when you're saying you're divesting from Canada's energy sector.
Yeah, and that's actually an important point of this, because when the Canadian energy sector is weakened, it means that the demand just shifts to other parts of the world. The product itself does not go down in demand. I know there was something that your organization mentioned previously, which is that if the oil and gas that is provided by Canada is not needed, all we're going to do is get it from Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia. And there's a lot of just common sense missing from the crusade against the Canadian energy sector.
That's right, and that's what we're trying to insert some common sense into the fight.
Now, let me ask you about where this is actually going from here, because there's a risk as well, I think, that when more of this becomes mainstreamed, it only extends further. So for now, it could be a pension fund saying we don't want to invest in the energy sector, and then the next step could be we don't want to invest in companies that invest in that unless they don't invest in the energy sector. Right. And at a certain point, it becomes where people are trying to wall off this entire industry, which is not just an industry, but a hugely critical one for Canada.
Yes, and it also extends to other sectors who rely on the oil and gas. It can extend to the other sectors that rely on the oil and gas industry to operate, the manufacturing sector, the mining sector, agriculture. All sectors really rely on the energy, hydrocarbons, to run their businesses. So it's a slippery slope, and we're trying to halt it and present the other side.
One of the things that InvestNow says is that divestment cannot alter basic economic realities. In that sense, why does this matter? Why does divestment pose a risk if it really, in your view, doesn't change all that much?
Well, if companies, if the investment climate is not welcoming to companies, they'll take their business elsewhere. So companies need capital to do their business, especially public companies, obviously. And if people aren't investing in these companies, they will go to a more favorable climate, which is leaving Canada. And
that's something we've already seen too much of. I don't think we need to see any more of it, nor do we want to.
No, especially at this time when we're trying to dig ourselves out.
Yeah, but you raise an important point there, which is that now especially, I mean, I'd argue there's never a time we want to be waging war against Canadian business, but now especially, we can't afford to be picking and choosing on these really bizarre and skewed supposed moral grounds which companies are worth doing business with and which aren't.
That's right. And they're providing jobs. Well, jobs is a moral issue as well, providing jobs for people, livelihoods. Where do we draw the line? If you start looking at things from that perspective instead of from, okay, we're investing in this company, it's a good company, they're innovative, they're reducing emissions, and that's taken away. Those types of criteria are taken away if you just divest from the entire sector.
Now, let me ask a bit about InvestNow itself, because I know your background is obviously in finance. Is this coming about from people in the energy sector?
Yes. Well, I've been following the movement. The movement's about 10 years old in the United States and in UK. And in Canada, I've just noticed some of the universities. There's 6 universities now that have pledged to divest. I've been watching the movements for about 2 years, and I just see that it's extending its reach. And I've spoken to a few people. I have a group of investors that are interested in this movement and also presenting, as I said, the other side, which isn't being heard. I don't think people realize what's happening. So it's the protesters are out there, and we need to be out there as well to say, well, think about this and consider the other options.
And one thing you pointed out earlier that I wanted to circle back to was that a lot of this is being driven by a U.S. organization, you said, correct?
Yes.
And that means U.S. funding of this. And we know whenever the energy sector is involved, the amount of money that goes into the energy sector side of this thing is always vastly more than the pro-energy side is able to put in or historically willing to put in.
That's right. They're very well funded. As I said, they set up groups on campuses everywhere. You type in "Go Fossil Free blank university" and they're there, and the groups are set up. So we're behind in that sense that we also have to start setting up our groups that say, well, don't divest, invest.
So I know this is a new organization, and obviously everything this year is a little bit upside down as far as just how business is working and how communications are working. But have you found that there has been a receptiveness from some of the people that are being targeted by the anti-oil activists to at least hear you out?
Yes, I have. And also we could use this to our advantage, given the fact that students aren't on campus right now. So there aren't protests happening to the same effects that they were before. And I think by reaching out to boards of governors, university presidents, institutional funds, we can get our message across a little bit on the same footing as the other groups.
People always ask me when I bring up these issues what they can do about it. So I will ask, do you think there is a value in alumni reaching out to their boards of governors with a similar message?
Yes, I do. And I also think that they should consider the money going into the endowment fund. They're willing to accept any money coming into the endowment fund. Well, a lot of that time, it's money coming from the oil and gas sector or related to the oil and gas sector, like a plastics company did the biggest donation ever to Guelph. Well, that you can't have plastics without petrochemicals. So I also want to get across the interconnections between companies and the oil and gas sector. And I do think we are going to reach out to alumni and the corporate sector because they are the ones investing in the endowment funds to say, do you realize that this is also happening? They're taking the money on one hand and divesting from your sector on the other.
Well, I know we have a lot of people in the West that work in this sector, and even people just around the country that work in it or just care a lot about it. So I'm glad you're doing this. I know that a lot of people tend to try to downplay what's happening on campuses because it's just, what the universities are doing. But as we've seen time and time again, this can have a ripple effect, and this already is going in that direction. The organization InvestNow, you can learn more about it at investnow.org. The executive director, Gina Pappano, joins me. Gina, thank you so much, and congratulations on this.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. Have a good day.
So glad. Now, I actually just learned about what Gina was doing. I learned about InvestNow earlier in the week, and I instantly said, okay, this is something I have to talk about on the show. And the reason is because I alluded to it with Gina. So many times people will message me and say, well, yeah, this is terrible. The world's going to hell in a handbasket, but what can I do about it? So anytime we have an opportunity where there is an action item of sorts or a group that's taking action, I think it's good to spotlight that. So in this case, yeah, if you're a university alumnus and you are seeing this university that you have paid money to, that you have taken a degree from, start to go after this method of divestment, or at least entertaining it, you can push back against it, and you should push back against it. And the oil companies should not be giving money to these institutions if they don't want anything to do with the Canadian energy sector. We've got to wrap things up for today. We'll be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. If you support the work we are doing on this show, you can join the Andrew Lawton Show Club or the Producer Circle by heading over to tnc.news/donate, and we very much appreciate your support. We'll talk to you soon, Canada. Thank you, God bless, and good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.